Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Please join me in Gasho. Namo Amidabits, Namo Amidabits, Namo Amidabits, Namandabs, 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 Namandabs. Good morning, and thank you for joining us today. I'd like to spend this opportunity to talk about the Black Lives Matter movement. It's a conversation that is long overdue, and I do recognize that it's a conversation that many might find somewhat uncomfortable, but it's a necessary conversation, and it's important to note that this is a conversation that by its very nature is supposed to be somewhat uncomfortable. And realistically, if we're not feeling a little bit uncomfortable with a topic like this, then it means that we probably haven't thought about it or reflected on it in the way that maybe we should. And so that's kind of the spirit of this morning's discussion. I'm not going to recap every specific detail about the protests or the pervasive history of injustice that has afflicted black people and other people of color prior to the inception of this country. There's far better scholars, more learned people who you can consult on those topics. And you should consult those people and seek out that information if you have the ability to do so. And I also feel that, as an Asian American man, it's not really my position to really offer any kind of expertise on those topics, because my experience as a human being is fundamentally different from a person who's black, a person that's gone through different things than I have. Because my experience is so different, it would be disingenuous for me to ever pretend like I understand what anyone is going through, or to necessarily speak on behalf of anybody else. And so I don't want to do that either. I think it's important that we all recognize that all of our experiences of life are fundamentally different, and that because of that, we really do need to take the opportunity to listen to other people and reflect on the things that they're saying, and also to reflect on our own behavior as people who are all part of the same system. And that's kind of where I think we should approach it from. Now, when we talk about the Black Lives Matter movement, it is really easy to say things like we sympathize with the movement. And it's really easy to say things that, oh yeah, we understand this movement. And it's easy for us to clearly point to examples of police violence and police brutality that we deem to be excessive or wrong, and note that they need to change. That is very easy. It's very obvious to note those things. But it's a far more difficult thing for us to actually reflect on these events and to really try and make changes based off of things that we observe. And this is because if we simply stop there and we fail to help the actual situation in any kind of way, then in a lot of ways we're actively hurting the efforts of the people who are protesting actively for change. You can only help the situation if you're willing to look past what is convenient in this case and what is easy. And that sort of begins with the reflecting process. And in doing so, it does bring up some harsher realities rather than allowing us to sort of hide behind kind of convenient explanations. There's, of course, opportunities for us to reflect based off of the Buddhist teachings. And, of course, the history of traditional Buddhism gives us a lot of examples about how we can think about ways that we can kind of open up and reflect on our engagement in these sorts of processes. So, one of the stories that we all know is, of course, the story of Prince Siddhartha and how he became the Buddha, how he sat underneath the Bodhi tree. But the part of that story that I want to focus on today is the story of the four gates, the four different sites that the Buddha saw, or Prince Siddhartha saw before becoming a Buddha. The experiences, the sites that led him to recognize that he had to undertake a process of spiritual enlightenment. So when we think about this, Prince Siddhartha was, when he was young, prior to being a Buddha, was locked away in a palace with his mother and his father. He was wealthy. He was sheltered. And he had never been exposed to suffering in the world around him. He simply didn't know it existed because he lived a life in which he wanted nothing. Everything was provided for him because he was wealthy. He was, for all intents and purposes, we might regard him as extremely privileged. He had been bestowed with privilege from the day he was born, and he was allowed to check out of all the burdens of the world around him. And it wasn't until that he left the palace and was exposed on 4 different times to different aspects of the world around him that he began to actually grow in his consciousness and begin to ask questions and really pursue what it was that he had to do. The first day he encountered a man who was old and aging, and of course he realized at this point in time that he too would grow old and one day become like this old man. And on the second day that he left the palace, he encountered someone who was gravely sick, very ill, and he realized that this was also something that could potentially happen to him. He could become ill, right? Just like all people do become ill at different times. And on the third day, he encountered a funeral procession and saw a person who had died, a body. And of course, this taught him that all lives eventually come to an end. And then, of course, last but not least, he encountered a Jainist, or a holy man, who taught him, just through observation, that there was some sort of spiritual other way to deal with these sorts of things, to understand these different things. Now, these are the 4 sites that he sees that lead him on his journey to become an enlightened being, to really find out the truth about the world. And you can make an argument that without these 4 experiences, Siddhartha stays in that castle, never attains enlightenment, never becomes aware of all the suffering around him, never becomes a Buddha, and never shares his teachings with the rest of the world. It all comes down to these experiences and his willingness to engage with them, question his prior beliefs, open up as a person, and to listen to the community around him and decide to do something about it. He decides that what he needs to do is reflect and meditate on it, and eventually becomes a teacher for those efforts that are designed to help others, to literally bring the light to the rest of the world. There's a lot of commonality in this experience by Siddhartha and the experiences that we're seeing right now in the rest of the world, right? Because people are kind of realizing that it's not really just about, waking up, but it's about reflecting. And the thing is, it's like we oftentimes take the easy way out in these very uncomfortable discussions about race, about systematic oppression and systematic violence, because they're kind of inconvenient. But that's what we can't do. I think what we need to do is follow the Buddha's guidance here, based off these old stories. Because it would have been really, really easy for Siddhartha to look at an old, poor beggar who he had never encountered before, that seemed almost weird and foreign to him, and assume that that did not apply to him. Siddhartha could have sat there and said, well, the only reason he's poor and old is because he didn't work harder in his youth. And you can't really help people that aren't going to work hard, and, can't help them if they don't want to help themselves. And I'm rich, so it doesn't matter. And it would have been very easy for Siddhartha to look at this sick old man and say, well, he was at risk for illness, right? So he should have taken better care of himself when he was younger. Some people are just unhealthy, but it's not going to happen to me because I'm young and I have lots of wealth. It would have been equally easy for him to look at the funeral, the person who had passed away, and said, that's sad. But all people die, so what's the care about a single person who passes away? It would have been also very convenient for him to look at the holy man and say, he's never going to accomplish anything that way, and he should be more realistic. We have an opportunity here to open up our eyes and to see what is taking place around us, to really open our ears as well and to listen to the experiences of other people. Not just to reaffirm the teachings of the Buddha, but to understand the stories and experiences of the people around us who are suffering, truly suffering. And it's our job to recognize that we, like Siddhartha, have lived lives of relative privilege in different ways. Privilege that has allowed some of us, many of us, to overlook these atrocities for too long. And with the teachings of the Buddha as our guide, we have an opportunity to learn from those experiences and also our own struggles. But we have to be willing to let our guard down, to listen. Even as Buddhists who have worked throughout our lifetimes to understand the nature of suffering, it is incredibly difficult for us to understand this degree of systematic oppression. And oftentimes we say things that minimize these facts by comparing these experiences to our own. Sure, they're suffering, but my ancestors also suffered too in internment camps. And yeah, there's police brutality, but there's far worse racism in the 1930s against the Irish or the Chinese. Or we say things like, this is a socioeconomic situation, not a race problem. Let's be realistic. Or, racism is only racism when someone does something intentionally. And you can't blame people for making mistakes when it's not what they intended. These are phrases that many people say, they think to themselves. It's not intended to worsen the situation, but these phrases and words like these don't help either, simply because they don't acknowledge that there's a problem that needs to be fixed, that needs to be addressed. A group of people are suffering right there in front of us, and they're suffering in a way that we, at this moment, are not suffering. Because most of us don't feel like we're going to be shot, when we're pulled over for speeding through a stop sign. And others of us don't necessarily know what it's like to be denied a loan based off of our name or where we live. And a lot of us don't understand what it's like to not be able to send your kid to a different school, or the ability to go to a different school yourself just based off of your zip code. These are all opportunities that many of us possess, and they're privileges that we take for granted sometimes. And no matter what our experiences are like, this isn't a competition. This is about helping people. And that's all this is about. When we do this, when we make exceptions or excuses, we are not taking time to listen. We aren't taking time to understand. We're just talking to ourselves and making up stories that boost up our own sense of who we are, our own ego and our own ignorance. And we remove ourselves from the situation, this entirely sticky, convoluted, complicated situation. It makes us feel like we're above this, or it doesn't involve us, so we should just tuck our heads down and pretend like it's not going to be an issue. And this, of course, makes the situation worse. This convenient act of privilege allows us and allows the system of oppression to continue unchecked. And it's easy to do this, but it's not the right thing to do. And so what we need to do is, like the Buddha, look at the experiences around us, listen to the voices of the people who are suffering, and reflect on how we fit into this equation as well. And from there, we need to act. And the way we do that is to support these voices, support the people who are promoting solutions to these problems. Okay? And of course, when we hear the voices that we know need to be heard, true, actual, knowledge and actual accounts of what's taking place and how to fix these problems, we need to empower those voices. We need to look for the marginalized and overlooked individuals of our society that have not been heard and give them a chance to be heard. It's important that we also don't drown them out or press our own beliefs upon them or script out some self-serving narrative about how things are supposed to go. Our job is to listen, and from there to amplify the voices of marginalized groups, so that it doesn't just stop with us learning something, but actually allows others to do the same and push for true reforms and change that need to take place. We are not the solution to the problem here, but we can certainly be part of the solution. And as the food critic Dave Chang says, the best way that we think of this is that we're kind of like witnesses to a crime. And when you witness a crime, you have a choice. You can either put your head into the sand and hide away from it, or you can let others know about it. And if you're further interested in learning more, again, I'm not an authority on any of this stuff, and I don't want to speak on behalf of any other people, but I have attached some links to this discussion for you guys to take a look at, so you can learn some more about this topic, so you can kind of dive into it at your own comfort level and understand what it is that the more complicated avenues of this discussion. And, there's some opportunities to also donate if that's what you choose to do as well. Again, thank you for listening. I appreciate your time. And I know, while it's difficult out there, please understand that we are all in this together. Please join me in Gasho. Namo Amidabutsu, Namo Amidabutsu, Namo Amidabutsu, Namon Dumps, Namon Dumps, Namon Dumps.